Thank you, and welcome to the Child Welfare Information Technology Systems Managers and Staff webinar series brought to you on behalf of the Health and Human Services Administration for Children and Families, Children's Bureau, and presented by ICF International. Today's webinar is entitled IT Modernization and Agile Processes. I am Joyce Rose, your host and moderator for today's webinar. Next, please. Attendees are encouraged to participate in our webinar with questions and comments. However, all of the participant lines are muted now, but we will open them for the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. Please be aware that you can submit questions at any time using the GoToWebinar chat feature, and those too will be addressed during the Q&A session. Should we run out of time, we will respond to your questions via email, and/or should you have additional questions, you may submit those to Mr. Terry Watt at the email address listed on the slide.
Terry Watt can be reached by email at terry.watt.act@acf.hhs.gov.
Next, please. It is a pleasure to welcome today's presenters. Mr. Rafael Lopez, the Commissioner of the Administration for Children, Youth, and Families. Mr. Dave Zemich, Acquisition Manager Director, GSA 18F. John Boulay, Director of California's Office of Systems Integration. Ms. Amy Tong, Chief Deputy Director, California Office of Systems Integration. And Mr. Terry Watt, Director, the Division of State Systems in the Children's Bureau. Next, please. A brief look at today's agenda. We will start off with the Commissioner's welcome, followed by a segment talking about structuring your acquisition process for success by Mr. Stenich, a discussion of modular procurement to support the agile software development by Ms. Tong and Mr. Boulay. We will then have our attendee Q&A session and then followed by a brief conclusion. And now, I would like to welcome Commissioner Lopez. Thank you.
Thank you so much for welcoming everybody and to framing up today's conference call. Once again, this is Rafael Lopez, and I am thrilled to be here in Washington, D.C., surrounded by several colleagues and many of you throughout the country. We understand that there are folks joining us from Maine to Florida, from California to Alaska, and we're thrilled that we have so many people who are interested in helping think through how we can make a huge impact on the lives of children, youth, and families in America served by child welfare systems. This particular slide that you see in front of you actually is a little bit of a joke, right? Sort of the notion of the Greek mythology of Sisyphus, committed to eternity of rolling that boulder up a hill. And when we were thinking about a lot of the work that you all do who are on this call, we thought about how oftentimes you don't get thanked for all the hard work that you do. You don't get thanked for how you put the pieces of the puzzle together in child welfare, and that you don't often get recognized for the tremendous amount of work that you do to really make sense of what is a very complicated system that really begs for tons of innovation and creativity. So first of all, on behalf of the administration, thank you for all you do. We know that sometimes it feels like you're pushing that boulder up a hill and watching it roll down again, but really we don't believe that we are committed to eternity to doing work this way. We think that we can make a huge difference in the lives of children and families by really being smarter about the way we work, building on your successes, building also on your failures, and sort of naming the elephants in the room that challenge us on this issue. We know that you work constantly to figure out how to improve solutions to CFSR outcomes and pulling data from multiple systems that oftentimes don't work at your fingertips the way you'd like to. We know that you have to navigate multiple bureaucracies and really sort of be agile on your own time to respond to the various people, whether they're social workers or principals or governors in the various states in which you work, to make sure that we provide better solutions to child welfare services. And we're thrilled to talk to you about some new ways that we want to approach this work to ensure that the best technology is available to support the systems you work on and the folks you serve. And that's really what we're about today. really focusing in on the fact that every single one of you on this call, regardless of your title, regardless of whether or not you're a contractor or a state civil servant or a Fed or someone who's just interested, that you absolutely have a role in helping shape the lives and the futures of children, youth, and families in America, and that you aren't powerless at being able to change what we do. The technology exists right now to do things much better than we've done them, and we have to figure out how to navigate our various bureaucratic systems. Next slide, please. So in that context of no longer pushing, this boulder up the hill for eternity and feeling like we're watching it roll down the hill again in mistakes, just to give us some context in the numbers, we've spent over the last 23 years collectively as a country and states that we know about, by the way, nearly $3 billion. $3 billion in building a series of systems that we know frustrate you, that we know frustrate people who are working directly in child welfare to serve children, and that oftentimes are frustrating simply to manage because technology is advancing so quickly that we can't quite keep up. And so we want to make sure that we are setting the stage not only for this discussion, but the kinds of risks that you're going to take moving forward, which is really all about how we can be much more agile, not simply with our procurement in IT space, but in the way in which we interact with each other, in the way in which we break down the silos that have often stopped us from communicating not just within our own systems, but across systems, from city to county to state to Fed and everywhere in between. How we collectively work with tribes, for example, and the difficult, often relationships between capturing data within tribes and feeding that into state systems and getting up to the federal government. We want to be thoughtful about really taking a look at the child welfare information systems that are oftentimes too expensive, as I just listed up, and take far too long to deliver. And if anybody in the country, we know that all of you on this call know this firsthand, because oftentimes it diverts your attention. It diverts your ability to sort of be innovative and creative and responding to the needs of children and families. And in fact, you are constantly working at trying to get better responses to making your systems work. We know that it costs you more money, and not only just time, but more money to figure out how to make those connections work and pulls you away from the things that really matter, which is helping serve our children, youth, and families. We know that traditional procurement systems and system development approaches add years to the development of key data. And why is it that in child welfare in this country, we should expect that it should take a decade or a decade and a half to go from development of an RFP to delivery of a product that is meeting the needs, changing needs in a community? We believe that we've developed a framework for modular contracting and federal procurement. And as you know, because this is our reality, federal folks don't have this completely figured out, and neither do all of you, but together we think we can do much better at figuring this out. We think that an incremental, iterative process is much more responsive to the user, and in that case, right now, it is all of you who are day in and day out making sure that you're trying to make sense of these systems. We want to be able to collaborate across multiple silos and deliver better systems with much more efficiency at a lower cost in a faster environment. We think that is possible. In fact, we know it's possible. We also believe that we can improve how we invest our resources and be much more strategic about them, and to share our lessons learned and to share our challenges, and to lower the risk of project failure overall. Even though we learn from those failures, why is it that over time we've allowed ourselves to accept the length of time it takes and the cost of those failures for child welfare? We also believe that we could be much more responsive and adaptive to changing user needs. So from the frontline social worker staff who's doing an emergency call 24/7, to the commissioner or state secretary reporting data to the governor, to the President of the United States who wants to know exactly what's happening to kids in America. Finally, we want to frame up that as we've done this work with our federal family, we've also partnered some of our thinking and doing with folks who are willing to take bold risk steps in their state systems. And we chose the very easy, small little state of California to look at multi-year, multi-million-dollar SACWIS procurement, which has thousands and thousands of pages ultimately that had been in their RFP, and ultimately would have lasted in a much longer contract had they not approached us and said, how can you help us think this through differently? We believe that in our early work testing out this strategy with California, that we've uncovered both the joy of trying to think outside these boxes, the joy of figuring out how to better apply technology and innovation to a very clear, concise problem that California was willing to solve, and try to figure out how we could really change course in a radical way. how we could, one, do a set of smaller RFPs by making sure that we could buy user-centered, agile, and iterative development. Two, we wanted to make sure that our state staff, who you'll be hearing from shortly, that they led and were able to better understand, direct, and control the development of critical technology needs to protect children in California and to deliver those services at a much faster pace instead of waiting for a decade or more, again, from beginning to end. We'll hear from state staff who provided the leadership, that courage, and that risk-taking, who, by the way, navigated an even more complex bureaucratic system, squarely landing in procurement and testing the boundaries of what was acceptable or not given existing California state codes as approved by the legislators, and also tapping into the leadership of the governor's office in California. We'll also hear from our friends here at the General Services Administration and listen to our friends about what they've done to dramatically try to push the federal government or nudge them into really putting these agile practices in place and the new reality of agile, modular, and modernized procurement, which, as I said, again, sort of naming the elephant in the room, we haven't got it completely figured out. We're working on it, but we want to lift up ways in which actually it's starting to work and why we put this call together. We want to make sure that your questions and your feedback, however supportive or critical or everywhere in between, push our thinking, not just because we'll have the answers, but because together we'll actually come up with far better answers if we take risks amongst ourselves to name the things that challenge us. We want that feedback, and we want to hone our approach and make sure that we are efficiently sharing what we learn across the country. Next slide, please. At the end of the day, what this is all about is not all the pieces that I just lifted up, but in fact, it's about the kids in America. That bottom line, by the research, by the data, by the science, and by our common sense, we know for a fact that a young baby or a child at any moment in their life, if they are to enter our child welfare system, they are more at risk of not graduating from high school, not going to college, not being able to be employed, and have a risk of being pregnant and or homeless within the first few years of aging out of child welfare. And it is not unconscionable to think that we can completely flip the script on how we approach child welfare. So with your help, from every single square mile of this country and all of your smart thinking, we think we can do much better, and we know we can with your help. With that end, I'll go to the next slide, and we are thrilled to introduce to you Dave Zvenich, who is our Acquisition Management Director at GSA and at 18F. Dave, take it away.
Great. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. It's a privilege and a thrill to be here today. Let me go directly to the next slide, because I'm sure many of you are wondering, what is 18F? Who is 18F? So first thing that you should know is that we are part of the United States government. We are a civic consultancy for the U.S. government within the U.S. government. We are federal employees. We are people from all over the United States, from all different walks of life, who've all joined the United States government with a single mission to deliver greater digital services to the United States people. And if you go to the next slide, there was a slide that was missing, or maybe a little bit later. We'll pick it up in a bit. But what you should know is that this is work that we have started in March of 2014, and we have been, in the last 2 years, have a number of successes, and we see a greater momentum, because what we're trying to do is to focus on a better, more modern way of developing digital services. So the first slide that you're looking at is My USCIS. This is one of the products that 18F has worked on. It's sort of one of our earliest things. This is, like child welfare system, a critical process in the United States government. How do we get people to apply for citizenship, check the status of their cases, and get help? It's a huge, critically stressful step in their lives that has been really difficult. And what we try to do is imagine what it would be like from the user's perspective of going through this process. And the developers, the designers, the product folks met with real users, met with other federal employees and other contractors to figure out how we can create a better user experience for people entering this country. Let's go to the next slide. This is beta.fec.gov. Similarly intractable problem. You've got the Federal Election Commission, which has bipartisan gridlock. You've got 3 Republicans and 3 Democrats. They can't agree on anything, but what they can agree upon is trying to provide better information to the American public about how they regulate elections, how they regulate the money that's raised and spent, and how people can run for office and how they should be regulated. And We have worked with the FEC, again, with vendors, with their lawyers, with their IT folks, to create a better user experience, focusing on open data, focusing on APIs, focusing on user-centered design, and building iteratively a better experience for folks. Now the next slide that I thought was earlier. 18F is not just here in DC. We started as 8 people in the District of Columbia, but now we are 165 people. We are now a minority of 18Fers in DC. Most of us exist throughout the United States. You'll see that there's a presence in California, but there's a presence in Boston and Austin and Minneapolis and throughout the United States. And like I said, we are not just not just developers, not just designers, not just product folks, but we are all feds, and we all have a single mission on trying to make better experience for people who have to interact with the government. So what does this have to do with you all? So around November of last year, we had our first opportunity to really work with states. So as a federal agency, we were principally working with federal agencies. And then fortunately, Raphael in California brought us into the fold and said, can you help the state of California who wants to try a slightly different way of doing things? And for my sake, I leaped at it. So I'm the person on the right. I'm Dave Svenich. Just to give you a little bit of background about who I am, I'm an attorney by training. I spent 4 years before coming to 18F as the general counsel to the District of Columbia Council, the legislature in D.C. I'm also a software developer and someone who had experience in acquisition. And when I had an opportunity to work to try to make a better procurement process in the federal government, I leaped at it. But understand that my heart was at the D.C. government. I was a state person who struggled with a lot of the systems that you all interact with, and I had many, many years of feeling the pain of not getting great services provided to the residents of the District of Columbia and trying to figure out a better way of doing it. Happily, at 18F, we have found some of the things that will allow it to be successful, and the federal government, we've really been trying to push that forward. I'm also not on the phone with me, but as part of my team, I'm delighted to have Robin Carnahan, who was a state official in Missouri, who also went through the same pain of trying to get vendors to deliver great products and not having the ability to know that it was going to work. And not because of the vendors, but because we didn't have the right process set up in place. And if we could have a better process, we could actually get consistently better results. So with that introduction, let's go to the next slide and understand how we think that you can do a better job and what we've seen work. So in the federal government, we have the United States Digital Services, and the USDS put out this thing called the Digital Services Playbook. And it has a bunch of plays. If you go to playbook.cio.gov, you can find all of the plays that we are using in the federal government to get more responsive, more agile experiences for the American public. But I'm highlighting 3 because I think they're the 3 most relevant for what we're discussing today. So the first is user-centered design. So what is user-centered design? Well, the first thing that you'll see is that this is actually a definition that's not from me. This is a definition that's now baked into an RFP of the state of California. And it says, though the needs of agency stakeholders are important, the satisfaction of citizens or other end users are the primary way we measure success. Now pause and think about that. What this means is that your end users, the people who are actually touching the system, is the primary way that you evaluate whether the product is good. It's not based on whether I, sitting in Washington, think this is a good idea. It's what users who are working with the system are actually experiencing that determines whether it's successful. There is a huge body of practice that exists about how to implement user-centered design, and if you're not doing it, you're doing it wrong. So the second major pillar is agile development. Now this is not. We got some feedback. This is actually from the 18F, one of the 18F guides, and it says, agile development values working code over documentation, iterative developments based on validation with the target audience with focused efforts that deliver value in short sprints that allow for a regular feedback loop. What is that about? Well, Agile contemplates the idea that you get short bursts of working software and validating every single increment. So rather than imagining 5 years down the road, you drop through the system and you say, well, I hope that worked, you learn as you go. Because at the end of the day, what everyone knows here is that I can't predict 5 years from now. I have no idea what 5 years looks like. I know what tomorrow looks like. I know what 2 weeks from now looks like. I know what 2 weeks from now looks like. And as it turns out, if you keep moving in that sort of incremental way, you're ultimately going to get better results. The last bit is actually, this is, surprisingly enough, this is a federal rule now. This is baked into OMB guidance to the federal agencies as a thing called modular acquisition. And this is the language. It says, after a law called FITARA, and I won't bore you about that, but this is the thing to focus on. It says, for development of software or services, planned and actual delivery of new or modified technical functionality to users occurs at least every 6 months. So what FITARA now is by law requiring, and OMB has implemented through regulations, is that I can't wait for a year or 2 years to see my product. I need to have delivered working software to end users in 6 months or less, which is a radically different way of thinking about the procurement cycle in the federal government, and it's ultimately one that has been, that will drive a lot of better results and better outcomes for citizens. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. So I told you about these techniques, but it's important to understand why. Why would we use these techniques in the first place? Next slide. So there are at least four reasons that you should use these techniques. The first one is reduced risk of project failure. If we're being honest with ourselves, we know that a lot of IT projects end in failure. The majority of them end in failure. So at the outset, project failure is not something that we should be afraid of, right? But what we should be afraid of is not trying to reduce the risk of project failure. And if we focus on trying to use less risky methods to get results, then we're going to be in a good shape. Well, as it turns out, listening to end users, building things that you know are valid requirements, and doing them in short turnaround time leads to lower risk of failure, because you know that at each increment you're getting working software that meets actual users' needs. You're not anticipating, oh, well, maybe 6 months from now, 2 years from now, 5 years from now, a user might need a thing. I know that I have actually validated a user's need and delivered something of value to them. Relatedly, you get an improved user experience. If you have to read a user's guide in order to use a website, it's not going to work. You need a user experience that's intuitive, that's joyful, that allows people to do what they need to do, which is provide service to the children in your state. We also have lower costs over the project lifecycle. I'm not going to say that we know exactly how much. I'm not going to say that it's going to save you billions of dollars. I don't know. But what we do know is that doing the right thing and having sort of an improved, validated incremental process will avoid unexpected downstream lock-in in things that are not useful and allowing you to buy only what you have validated as useful. And so even if there are upfront costs, and I don't think that there are, but you will have lower costs over the life cycle because the product that you're building is going to be validated and useful to the people who are using it. And there's also a broader opportunity for vendor engagement. So one of the things that I like to highlight is that by having modular procurement, by having smaller contracts, by having a greater emphasis on competition, you're no longer locked into one vendor. You now have a variety of vendors who you can work with. And frankly, the vendors know that they have more opportunity to compete with each other to deliver good work. Vendors want to deliver great, excellent, high-quality products to serve the public, and you give them more opportunity to do it, invite a larger pool of vendors who can provide these services at a greater level of success for the state and also for them. So that's why you should use it. Let's go to the next slide. What do you need to do to get it to work? Let's go to the next slide. So the first and almost most important thing that you're going to need is you're going to need an empowered product owner with the necessary infrastructure and support. I cannot emphasize this enough. When you hear from the state of California, you're going to hear about all of the things that we did, but one of the things that was never in doubt is that they had the necessary support from above and from below, and they were empowered to make the necessary decisions. This is so critical for success, because if you're waiting for a committee to decide whether or not you're going to ship a feature, you're not going to ship the feature that works. What you need is an empowered product owner who can make those decisions and make sure that they have the necessary resources to get things done. You also need a commitment to user-centered design. I cannot tell you how hard this is for a lot of people to, and I'm going to use a technical term, to grok until they actually see it. User-centered design feels uncomfortable at first because you actually have to interact with real people. You can't, you can't simply rely on, studies or research or what you think people might want. You actually have to talk to real people, interview them, experience them, gain empathy for what they're going through so that you can deliver products that work for them. You also need an integrated product and acquisition team. So one of the things that I find humorous about procurement is that we talk about agile procurement, but we haven't really focused on agile procurement processes. In other words, waterfall has this long requirement stage, and you have this long design stage, and then this long development stage, and then you have this long testing stage, and then production. Well, guess what? Procurement feels a lot like that, too. I've got my program office doing a long requirements gathering, and then I throw it to the contracting officer. The contracting officer throws it back to the program office. They throw it over to legal, and you have this very gated process. But in Agile, you focus on interactions. You focus on people talking to each other and collaborating with each other. And so you really need an integrated product and acquisition team so that your contracting officers gain empathy for what the program is going through. And program office understands the risks and the challenges that the acquisition team is going through. One of the most exciting moments for me when I was in Sacramento was sitting down with the lawyers, and California can validate this. As a lawyer, I was excited to sit down with lawyers, to sit down with the lawyers and try to help them understand what Agile looks like, and then being able to say, oh, we actually have this ability to enable better results from the program team. And so having that integrated team, product, and acquisition team is really key. This next one's a bit hard. You have to assume some responsibility for the system that you're integrating. We cannot engage in a world in which we simply say, I'm going to trust one vendor to deliver it for me. This is your most important system. This is your system that now drives most of the choices that you as an office are running. So if you basically delegate all of your authority away, you're not going to be able to know what it's doing. You need to take some responsibility for making the choices about what's most important to you as an office and how it's going to work. As it turns out, this risk is going to be borne by you anyway because laws change, practices change, and you need to have your system do what you need it to do and be responsive and in real time. Also, you need to have some conversations. Right? You can't have a world in which your decision makers and your developers and designers don't talk to each other. There's one of the concepts in Agile software is that if your developers never meet your users, you're going to fail. So you need your developers to gain empathy for your users. You need your designers to actually interact with users in order for them to build the right thing at the right time. So conversations and interaction are really important, and the only way that you can do that is to create a shared sense of responsibility. And the last thing that's needed is this is not easy. This is not something that's intuitive. We have all gone through a long practice of doing the old way of business. It's going to require some weird moments. It's going to require some uncomfortable conversations. But ultimately, we all have to be able to adapt. We all have to be able to respond to change. And we all have to accept the reality that this, as the commissioner noted, this is for the children. We have to be able to do what's best for the children, and we have to accept that what we've been doing before may not be what's in their best interest. So we have to adapt to meet their needs. All right. Last slide. Who needs to be involved? So there are three types of people that need to be involved, and I use people a little bit loosely because it's actually groups. You need a governance structure. So you're going to need top-level executive support. You cannot do any of this unless you have leadership who's willing to try this out and willing to do it differently. And not only do you have to have the formal buy-in, but you actually have to have the practical buy-in, ones that say, I'm going to facilitate continuous delivery. I'm not going to stand in the way of the developers and the product owner and the service teams. I'm going to facilitate them to get things done. But a governance structure that sets the overall vision, the high-level objective of all of this has to be set from the top. The top has to say, at the end of all of this spend, at the end of all of this development, at the end of the day, this is the vision for what we're building. And that has to come from a high-level governance structure. Below that governance structure, you need a project team. So a project team, sometimes a product team, depending on how you spin it. A project team is responsible for the overall service with a single empowered product owner. This is the person at the end of the day who is able to, quote unquote, call the shots, but who is able to interact with the governance team and the service teams below to make sure that everyone knows who makes that decision, but they're ultimately responsible for the decisions that are made. And you really need an empowered product owner, but they don't operate by their own. They have their own team. They have their own folks that they can rely on and provide good insight and judgment. And then you also need really good service teams. These are the folks who are going to be working at the ground level. These are sometimes called your SMEs, sometimes called your program offices, but you need people who are actually going to facilitate the identification of users. They're going to work with the project team to answer questions about what the needs are and what the priorities are, and you really need folks to feel that they are empowered to deliver and provide candid feedback about how the process is going. So you need all of it. You need a governance structure, a project team, and then service teams below. And like I said, this is not all that foreign to the way that we have treated the structures, but what is different is the idea that you are placing trust in people to carry out lower risk but higher validation of delivery on a regular basis. So the next slide, just to give you a sense of who needs to be involved, this is actually the team on the last day of the California effort. There were a group of us from DC. There were a group of us there were actually at least a few of us from San Francisco, and then a majority of people in Sacramento, all of whom were committed to try to get this result. This is not a single effort of a single person. This is a shared responsibility, but it's ultimately one that matters deeply. So thank you all for letting me have the opportunity to chat with you, and I will turn it next to John Boulay and Amy Tong in California.
Thank you, Dave, and good morning from California. It's still morning here in California. And I'm joined by OSI Chief Deputy Director Amy Tong, who just walked in my office from downtown in a pre-hearing for some of the budget things that we're going through. And also joining me, we brought in our Agile expert, and that's Mr. Peter Kelly, who is our Deputy Director over our newly named division, the Child Welfare Digital Services Division. I love the way that Raphael, Commissioner Lopez, started out talking about the joy of the work we did. I never used that word before, but you know what, as Dave talked about it, and the joy of the people that we have to serve, it does resonate with me because really it's about engagement and empowerment. I purposely did not use a whole bunch of slides today because a lot of the benefits that Dave has articulated, I really want to talk about the California story, how we went through this process and made a decision to make this pivot from the traditional way of doing project management and project delivery in government, which has been done for many years and has many processes and procedures built around it and many control mechanisms built around that, to very quickly pivoting to a different way of doing our business. And I am not an Agile expert. And when I looked at this, and for my colleagues in the state, it's intimidating. There's a knowledge gap. We're going to make mistakes. But why are we looking at this? Is because it's an iterative process. It reduces risks. And we don't throw away all of our knowledge. We use our knowledge in a different way to be able to provide things quicker, faster, smarter from a user-centric design. So that's the story that I want to walk you through today on how we got to where we are today, which is very much the beginning of our journey. And I'm going to be asking Amy as well as Peter to join in on the conversation. Just a little backdrop so you guys can sort of draw parallels from your organization to the state of California. The California Office of Systems Integration is actually an office within the California Health and Human Services Agency. We are responsible for the child welfare legacy system as well as procuring and delivering the new system. And when I say it isn't just OSI, we're doing that in partnership with the California Department of Social Services, who administers the child welfare program, as well as our county government, our Child Welfare Directors Association, our counties, our probation officers, the child welfare professionals across the state. We do that in concert with them. And when we talk a little bit about our governance is really a process that has to respect project management, product ownership, and project delivery and the users in our governance model. We're fortunate to be able to talk to you today, but we do represent the thousands of people that are making this decision to switch and to do a better way of doing business. OSI also oversees the statewide automated welfare systems, our eligibility systems within the state that are run by our counties through 3 consortia systems. We oversee that and work with them. We run our electronic benefit services projects and programs. We are overseeing and running the California Health Benefit Exchange with Covered California, as well as our partners from the Department of Healthcare Services. And we are kicking off a new project to be able to automate our WIC benefits, sending those through EBT cards with the Department of Public Health. So as you look at the Office of Systems Integration, we are a project management, procurement, delivery arm within Health and Human Services, where we partner with our 15 offices and departments within Health and Human Services to be able to look at project management, make sure that we're delivering, and make sure that our users are represented in the products that they provide. But we've all had challenges as we've gone through these processes. We know that procurement can be challenging, as Dave talked about, that some of our approaches and control mechanisms can drag these projects out. So this is what's led us to a pivot. Prior to looking at the pivot, I also want to tell you about the size of the child welfare program and personnel in California. There are nearly 500,000 reports of severe maltreatment and life-threatening neglect of children in California per year. Of those, around 80,000 reports are confirmed annually, and there's about 30,000 children that actually must be removed from their homes. And there's almost 100,000 children across the state of California that are living in foster care. And the legacy system that the child welfare professionals have to work with is inadequate, and that's what's led us to that. And there is over 20,000 end users using that legacy system. So with that as the backdrop, last November, we had a team with Department of Social Services in our counties and with OSI working together that had been working for over a year to get a single large monolithic procurement pulled together to be able to get a single monolithic relationship with a single system integration vendor together to be able to do, hundreds of millions of dollars worth of business with a single vendor. I think, as Dave talked about, it's looking at things differently and seeing what is that going to result in. I think the reality, and sort of weaving in the story, is that Will Lightbourne, the director of the California Department of Social Services, and I got the distinct pleasure of going into Health and Human Services Director, Secretary's office, Diana Dooley, and laying out sort of our monolithic procurement approach and schedule and time frame. And Will and I, as well as Amy, our chief deputy, and Pete Travinka, the chief deputy, sat down and started to walk our secretary and undersecretary through that. And we said, we're going to be releasing, and this is November of 15, this procurement. Okay, fantastic. We're on the brink. Okay, when are we going to start having the system delivered? Well, 19 months from now, we should have a contract. So 19 months from now, the child welfare professionals are going to be getting some usable software. No, we should be able to finish negotiations, any protest periods and things like that, and get to a contract in 19 months. Okay, what's after that? Well, we have to look at system development and those types of things, and it's probably going to be at least another 40 months until we're at a point where we're going to start rolling out some of this new functionality. So we're going to be 5 years out before we can help the child welfare professionals in the counties. Well, yeah, that's sort of the process that we're going through to be able to do that. And that was unacceptable. Mentioned that the governor came into office and in his first term authorized a planning project to be able to get to procurement. He got elected for a second term, and in that second term, we're barely going to be getting the contract with a vendor, let alone usable software. At the same time, the Department of Social Services engaged with Code for America to say, help us out in looking at our processes and how we're going forward with this. And with that, they engaged with the administration, and Raphael and his team, Terry Watt and his staff have been fantastic in their partnership and looking at this a different way. And they brought resources to bear with our executives. And when Dave says you need executive support and executive buy-in and oversight, that is 100% accurate. You can't do this alone. It can't be a single department. It can't be a single initiative. You need to make sure that your state is committed and is standing at the right place to be able to do that. So, as the discussion started, Secretary Dooley and Undersecretary Michael Wilkening from Health and Human Services sat down along with Mary Bell Batcher, who is our Government Operations Secretary, and her Deputy Secretary, Stuart Drown, with our leadership, with folks from the administration, Code for America, 18F, and started to look at how can we do things differently and what can we do. Everybody was encouraged that says we can do this different. We don't have to wait 5 years. We all have experienced systems and projects where at the end of working your tail off, a user has this system, it gets implemented, it's a tough and rocky rollout, and a user said, well, it might be just what I asked for, but it isn't what I want, and it doesn't help me in the day-to-day. So how can we do that differently? So we had to make sure that we could do this. So what happened is we assembled a strike force of procurement experts, legal experts, program experts, and project management experts, and locked them in a conference room for about 3 weeks across from the state capitol. And at the secretary and cabinet level for the governor's office, it was find out if legally, looking at California procurement laws, regulations, and rules, if we can legally do this. And your job is to get to yes, and if you get to no, you have to be able to identify those things and mitigate those things. And then the executive leadership, that's at the cabinet level for the governor, every day was coming in at 4:30, 5 o'clock to get a report out from that team. That team worked tirelessly along with 18F to be able to get to the result of, yes, we can do that. So then it was looking across the table and say, do we want to do that? We are just about ready to release a monolithic procurement that we worked for years on. Do we want to do that? The answer was an overwhelming yes. This is why we've gotten into government, is to make a difference, to do things differently, and to make a difference. Our child welfare professionals and the kids that they protect deserve us to do things differently. Technology is changing too fast to have technical requirements that are probably at least are backwards looking, and have a regulatory environment that we know is changing, that it doesn't respect that regulatory environment. So at that time, we said we're going to make this move, but we have to make sure that we have the air cover that Dave talked about. So what we had to do is we had to quickly communicate with our Department of Finance. We had to talk with our partners from county government. We had to talk with our legislators, and we had to talk with the governor's office. And a series of briefings commenced at that time to bring everybody on board. We got to yes. Now, everybody wasn't jumping up and down and saying this is perfect. The proof is in the pudding. We have to deliver. And if we don't deliver, we've told them that we do have the ability to iterate, to make changes and things like that, but we're being held accountable. So as Dave said, the single relationship with a single integration vendor, it's a facade of security. There isn't a single throat to choke. We are all accountable to these systems that we deliver. So this is a shared responsibility and a shared delivery model that we've moved to. So we've gotten everybody on board to definitely say yes, and now it's pivoting to that delivery. The delivery had to happen quick. So again, I gave you the backdrop that we had that single large monolithic procurement that had already been prepared. That was good work that was leveraged. There was thousands of hours in understanding a pretty mature business model, pretty mature documentation. There was hundreds of documents in a procurement library and a 1,500-plus page document that people had put a lot of good work in that gave us the ability, working with 18F and our state procurement and program experts, to take that and bust that up. What we did was we started to look at how can this business be put into modules, and how can we leverage those modules on top of our legacy system. Our legacy system is outdated technology that doesn't provide the functionality. However, it's built on a rock-solid, stable DB2 database that is very stable. So what we're doing is taking that stable database that is very well documented and putting an API layer over the top of that to be able to serve up the data to programmatic modules. So within a 3-week time frame, we put out an initial API module, and we put in our first business module, being the intake module, out onto the street. So prior to the beginning of 2016, we put them out on the street. I think one of the interesting things about putting it out on the street, and one of the communications that we had, was informing our vendor community that we were not going to do business as usual. All of the usual players were partnering up. They were getting all of their conglomerations of vendors together and getting ready to bid a multi-$100-million procurement. And we said, no, we're not going to do that. What we're going to do is we are going to take control of this. There's going to be product owners, and we're going to bust this up into smaller procurements. I've been involved in a number of vendor conferences in my career. I have to say the vendor conference that we had in Sacramento, when we informed the vendors of what we were doing with these procurements, was the largest I ever attended. We had over 100 people in the room and north of 100 people on a WebEx conference that were listening in, where we told them that we were making the switch to modular procurements, an agile development methodology, that custom code is going to have to be posted in open source, and the reason that we are making that change. And we sent a message for vendors that had traditionally done work with us, thank you, and we're doing business differently, and you have to understand that. And then for companies that weren't doing business with the state of California, because maybe the performance bonds or the risk that is on this or the initial investment was too great, take a second look at us. Take a look at these module procurements and see if you are now interested in doing business with us. We're encouraged because one of the things that has happened is, as we publish these, the vendor community has been engaged. Some of the vendor community hasn't been joyful, but they've been engaged. And what the engagement is, a lot of conversations and a lot of questions. We've had to issue 2 addenda to our RFPs, but we also, in a monolithic world, we expected maybe 2, 3, 4 intents to bid and probably getting about 2 or 3 bids in on the large procurement. We've gotten north of 20 intent to bids from a variety of new players that are looking at California differently, which is introducing a level of competition that we haven't experienced before and are starting to go through that. This isn't without challenge. Some of the challenges that we have is organizational challenges, knowledge challenges, and delivery. But the thing is that we put in a governance model that empowers our program from the counties who deliver it day to day, our project sponsors who have the policy and administer the program, and our project managers, systems integrators. I heard the good analogy that says sometimes the old processes sort of lock our people into these processes that don't give them the ability to show their talents. And as we made this shift and empowered these managers, you could see their talents come out because it's an environment where their talents are coming out and they're delivering. But we have to stay on top of that delivery. As we have further conference calls, because I know that people are going to be tracking California very closely, we'll have additional people. We have Peter here today, but we'll have additional people. But we're trying to give them the space and the room to be able to make sure that we're ready to deliver on those RFPs. We have future RFPs that are coming. And to be able to transform our project teams and our traditional project teams into agile development teams. So I've rattled on a little bit. I'm sure that there's some questions that are coming in, and I think I'd rather adjust the rest of the conversation to be more conversational and respond to your questions instead of us just rattling on about our California experience. Actually hear your questions and be able to sort of field those things and what our experience to date has been.
Joyce resumes as moderator.
Okay, John, thank you very much. Christy, will you advance the next slide, please? And I guess we will open up our Q&A session to our attendees.
Christy speaks.
Yes, at this time, folks are able to press *1 to unmute themselves to be placed in a queue for their question verbally. You may also ask the question via the chat, which I will read aloud. And we do have a question for California. Do you anticipate any challenges associated with the logistics of user training and training development, given quick development and quick deployment as releases are completed? And the two-part is, how are you planning for that?
John replies.
I'll start on that, and then I'll ask both Peter and Amy to join in. User-centered design and having that from the beginning and making the scope small enough so when we're looking at what the functionality is that you're delivering, having the user involved from the beginning, touching and feeling the software in 2-week sprints will help mitigate the size of the training. But training is important, and organizational change management is important. And that also, every single thing of project management is now iterative as we go forward. We will have an implementation and an organizational change management vendor that is working with us, but we're looking for an intuitive piece of software that users have touched, felt, and understand. And then, yes, we'll be engaging in organizational change management and training, but it won't be the traditional brick-mortar classroom type training that many of us have gone through in the past. It'll be more iterative, ongoing change management, adaptation to new software and releases as they come out. Peter, Amy?
I would add to that we have well-established training practices, regional training centers that the child welfare workers use in partnership with education facilities across the state. So we have a great structural support system to allow us to bookend this process against, and we intend initially to certainly leverage that extensively and continue, as John mentioned, to look for opportunities to support iterative updates. We expect that our implementation team will be getting feedback directly from the development teams at the completion of each sprint, so they'll be able to produce the content iteratively, but we also need to balance the implementation of content against the value that it delivers. And so while we will be accepting working functionality every 2 weeks, it would not be practical initially to deploy that functionality into a production environment into a user every 2 weeks. And so we have to balance what is the disruption to the user versus the value being delivered by that, and do that in a very methodical and intentional way until our organization can acclimate to a different way of delivering training potentially in the future, and is used to using the system in a new way. So basically take the process that we already have and learn and adapt to them as we go.
I'm good. You guys already covered it.
All right, next question.
Great. This one is for Commissioner Lopez. What have you been hearing from the states and tribes regarding the time and costs associated with their child welfare information systems projects, and why make the switch in Agile? How do you think this will address their time and cost issues?
Raphael replies.
Thank you for the question. Ultimately, and I would say pretty consistently across the country, I would say that on my visits, I hear the same consistent messages, which is that one, the systems they have are costly, they are outdated. Two, the technology is not reflective of what they want to do on the ground, that is responsive to their workforce and responsive to the kinds of requests that they need to both answer questions and also in real time manage their child welfare systems. Third issue is that they are burdened by antiquated and arcane procurement systems that simply can't bend to the sort of modern society, quite frankly. And fourth, the whole idea of why now, if not now, when, if not us, who, which is that if we look at just sort of the results of the child welfare system, and I mentioned that earlier on in the introduction, we know by the research and the data that we actually are not producing better results overall as a system nationally for kids in care. And we can do far better by being more responsive, by using technology as a tool. Technology innovation is not going to solve this really big national problem. It is a lever that we can use. It is a tool that we can use by really rethinking how we manage our child welfare system. So that's sort of what I'm hearing across the country in the way in which we're approaching the work.
Great, thank you. This next question is for Dave for 18F. What are the top 2 or 3 old practices or old thinking issues to address in remaking the procurement process? And what materials on the 18F website can help guide a state through rethinking or remaking their procurement processes to accommodate an agile or fast-track modular procurement?
Sure. Let me start with the second question first, which is what materials exist out there. So there are a couple of resources that lay it up for the federal space but are applicable in concept to the state space. So the first thing is, as I mentioned before, the Digital Services Playbook, which is at playbook.cio.gov. And there's also a thing that we call the TechFAR, TechFAR. If you Google it, you'll find it. The TechFAR. It's the federal acquisition regulations are the FAR, and they are a reading of the FAR that allows you to say, yep, these laws do not prohibit and, in fact, encourage agile software development. So those are two really great resources off the bat. I also think that the California solicitation, which is available, I think, on BidSync, has a lot of great language. If you are not looking at what California has done, I encourage you to do it, not just to think about open source as the software, but open source what they've done, open source their practice of getting it done. In terms of what are the 2 or 3 old practices or old thinking issues, the first is just timing. We hear 5-year, 10-year procurement cycles. The reality is that 10 years ago, iPhones didn't exist. 10 years from now, we may not even use websites. So the idea that we're going to procure a thing for 10 years from now or 5 years from now is ridiculous. We know that the technology that we put on this, that we put into a procurement document, if we wait 2 years for it to get the first delivered line of code, it's going to be obsolete by the time you do it. So we have to think about how we can shorten the lead time from the day that the RFP drops to the day that you start getting delivered code. So the old way of thinking about 5-year, 10-year contracts just has to go. It doesn't work. The second practice that needs to change is the idea that we operate in terms of rigid silos. It's historically been a bureaucratic instinct to say, I work for the office of X, and I work for the office of Y, and I'm in the office of Z, and I'm an expert in this particular thing, and only talk to the people within your group, and only talk to the people within your office. The reality is you have to work with each other. This is a shared responsibility between the procurement office, the legal office, the technology office, and make sure that everybody is in the same room when you're shaping your procurement document. When we were in California, one of the things that was actually a little bit uncomfortable at first is we had a large group of 80 people, and then we ultimately had to whittle it down to about 20 people who were actually going to sit down and write. We had to get people who were sitting in a room from different practice areas, from different experiences, sitting down and saying, this is what we want to go into the document, and actually writing that document. And that sort of that close collaboration among disciplines is really important for delivering a good result.
Hey, Dave, this is John. One other thing to add in there just from the California experience, and when we're working across silos, that includes your state control agencies. So we work very closely with the California Department of Technology and our state CIO, who historically provides independent project oversight of our projects. So they have to look at the way they do oversight of projects, probably some knowledge and skill gaps that they have to fill and be able to do that, but they were on board from the beginning of this pivot and looking at what we did because they have to be, because they're the ones that are going to be reporting to our Department of Finance and Legislature from our state CIO's office on what does this mean and is this a good idea. So, traditional, it isn't just technology, it isn't just program, it isn't just delivery, but it's also control agencies and funding agencies and people that do oversight on your project that you need to bring into the tent as you're making this pivot.
Great, thank you all. I'll just pause right here for a second while we check in with the operator to see if anyone on the phone would like to ask a question. And perhaps while we're waiting, I can address another question that has just came in. This is for California. Have you considered including the best value procurement methodology in your process?
John replies.
In that process, we are. It is a best value procurement. It isn't just low price. And actually, in looking at best value procurement, it's also looking at a completely different way of procurement. So the first couple of procurements that we've done are traditional RFP. We're looking at working with 18F as well as our Department of General Services in the state of California to have a pre-selected, a pre-qualified vendor pool that are skilled in Agile. So we're not measuring the ability of a company's bid department and putting together a bid. We're actually measuring their ability to deliver usable software that's workable. And that's going to take us doing things differently and looking at some of the gaps that we have to be able to fill that. We're going to be looking at the software engineers we have available across the state, not within our silo, but across the state that can evaluate that. And yes, partner with 18F so that they can assist us in creating that pre-qualified vendor pool. So hopefully as we go forward, we're going to be doing RFOs off of a master services agreement that's going to allow our project teams to be able to work more quickly to be able to acquire vendors. And if vendors aren't performing and aren't able to meet those, to be able to switch out to the next qualified vendor as they do that. But yes, all of this is best value and ability to deliver, and it isn't lowest cost.
Thank you. Operator, is there anyone in queue for questions?
Yes, we have Sylvia Knight. Your line is now open.
Yes, thank you. I'm interested in knowing how this changes the deliverable payment process, with vendors and the accountability along the way.
Peter responds.
So I'll take a crack, and Dave from the federal side, if you'd like to as well. So California recognizes that it has to, as Dave mentioned earlier, acknowledge and accept a portion of risk in the engagement with the contractors. And so while we talk about modular procurement, what we're talking about is delivering product. And the product may be an entire module or maybe component pieces of modules or functionality, but it's being done by a team of engineers, and we're paying the engineers for their effort. And so rather than paying for a specification document, we're going to pay for the output of a sprint, which is fully documented, tested, and accepted working source code that has been run through integration tests and run through acceptance tests with users. So the model and the deliverable is very different. The deliverable now is the output of the user story, and the payment is tied directly to that, with the state bearing risk in making the direction of which business stories provide the highest, which user stories provide the highest business value, and then paying for them for the effort directly.
Dave replies.
Yep, Peter nailed it. The only thing that I would add, and this is, I've written a blog post on the 18F blog. It's hard to find, though, so I'll just tell you what it is. One of the things that I focus on with Agile from a procurement perspective is that it's ultimately your secret weapon is transparency. You no longer have to hide behind someone saying, well, I've got documentation, but I can't show you the actual working software. If it's not tested by a user, if you can't describe what the user was supposed to do and then validate that the user has actually done it, the vendor hasn't delivered. So ultimately, by having user acceptance criteria as part of the beginning of your sprint, and then making sure that at the end of the sprint that particular feature is delivered, that gives you a lot of transparency into what your vendors are doing, and allows you to know that what you're paying for, you get what you're paying for. And so what we recommend doing is to focus away from thinking about getting payments for an end product, but instead paying for capacity, and then owning the responsibility internally for knowing what you think is most important. And that's by using your product owner and making sure that your vendors are doing what your product owner has prioritized based on user research, and paying for that instead of paying for what you think you might need 2 years from now.
Thank you. Operator, are there any other questions?
Yes, our next question is from Christine Townsend. Your line is now open.
We have two questions here. One is, if your current system is so old and unable to be maintained, what do you suggest? And the second question is your database that you mentioned you have DB2. What if we do not have a stable database?
So
Peter responds.
I'll start by saying why we found what we are intending to do viable, which may then speak to decisions that you need to make. Because we believe that we have a viable SQL-compliant enterprise-scale database, it allows us the ability to interoperate with our current system. If your current system does not have that same ability to have stability and interoperability, the processes of Agile software development still apply. It just may be that you need to build something that is not connected to and look at an evolutionary process of replacing it across silos. one of the things that we have to challenge ourselves with internally is always looking for opportunities for data interoperability. Oftentimes the going in thought is that it may be not possible, it may be complicated, but the concept of breaking work down into smaller pieces, reducing risk, allows us to look at each of those pieces independently as we grow the architecture of the system, and being able to find places within the business process that a disconnect between one system and another might make sense, or a disconnect in business process. But even at the end of the day, if none of that is possible, if you have to build an entirely new system from a point in time to implementation, and you cannot interact with your existing system, the value of working with the customers directly to figure out how to better service their needs versus doing something that perhaps doesn't take that into consideration until later in the game is not invalidated if you can't interoperate. So it really comes down to the specifics of your situation and where those opportunities are to determine what sort of interoperability you can have early in the process.
This is Amy. If I could jump in, and perhaps this might also address the first question that, how do we utilize? I think just dovetail to what Peter mentioned. At the end of the day, the Agile software development, yes, to have that user-centered interaction is something that we're going forward with, but that's not neglect. That does not reduce the need of have a very good, solid architectural effort in the background, just to make sure what are the components of your existing system that you could or could not leverage, which would alter what is the foundational work that needs to be done, so that the user interaction in building the system interfaces can be built upon that solid foundation. So I think, fortunately, that the California system, the existing system, gives us a good startup of that foundation. We still need to do some maneuver around it. That's why you heard about the API. But that, how solid is that foundation, it will be very, it will be depending on each cases.
This is Dave from ACYF. Just to sort of piggyback on both what Amy and Peter said, the challenge is unique to each state, but there are patterns that might be applicable in your case. And I don't know anything about your particular system, but you may have a data, there are many reasons why your data could be problematic. It could be a data entry problem, it could be a data integrity problem, it could be sort of a validation problem. There are lots of reasons why you could have issues. And deciding what makes the most sense to fix first, it depends on your particular case. But you're not the first person to have data challenges. Every system that's ever been built at some point has had a bug, and so the question is, how do you fix that bug quickest? And how do you sever the most painful thing in a way to allow you to have a better development platform? Sometimes it's just to declare bankruptcy and get rid of all the technical debt, but it's not usually the case. Usually you have to understand how you can unwind the particular problem and fix that thing, or at least get it to a stable place where you can do the next thing.
Thank you. Operator, are there any other questions over the phone?
I'm showing no further questions at this time.
Great. I'd like to move on to the chat questions. And this next question is for Mr. Terry Watt. When the new CWIS regulations come out, will they allow agile procurement and development?
There are no prohibitions in the CWIS regulations that would prohibit you from doing agile procurement and development. Besides that, Raphael's here, and he will make sure it happens.
Thank you. The next question, I believe, is geared towards California. With module development, how will California deal with having a part of the child welfare system on a new module like intake while the rest of the system is on the old system? And how will the case move along?
I think this is John. What I mentioned as I was going through our story is that we are going to build an API layer, which is going to be able to serve up the data from the DB2 database and integrate with each one of the modules. So the integration layer is at that API level, and that API level will have to iterate as well. So it's building upon that. So as each module comes up, we're going to have to expand that API layer to be able to integrate with each one of the modules as we go forward. So that's the most simplistic at the highest level. Peter can give more details.
So from a business perspective, that's really how we have looked at driving how we identify which pieces of functionality to begin with first. And it comes down to how the users utilize the solution, the existing legacy CWS CMS solution today, and how through research with our customers, how they need to leverage new system functionality as we go forward. So identifying business process natural breakpoints as being the integration points between component pieces, whether we call them modules or services, and identifying those natural and logical breakpoints to be the integration points means that we can subdivide the way that the users access the functionality and then use the technology solution to implement them. So, for example, intake being the first piece of work, intake is comprised of two major elements. One is the referral of an allegation for investigation, and then the other is the investigation of the allegation to determine what risk exists and what we need to then do to deal with the allegation. In some counties, those business functions are done by the same person. In other counties that are specialized, some of those business functions are separated apart. And so by working with the customer to understand at what point does the value of a new and better way of doing a business function exceed the potential pain or disruption to their existing business, those are the opportunities we're looking for to say, great, there's a natural breaking point or a line here where we would divide the business service. Let's use the technology to support incremental development of that piece and then move on to the next and move on to the next.
This is Amy. I'll just maybe one more point to help. That's from a business process. That's how we logically break the module up by sequence of what they do today. From a system perspective, keep in mind that whether you are using a new set of screens, if you were by the caseworker, aka the new intake module, or the counties are using an old set of screen to do the next function, both of those sets of screens are all talking to or pulling from same sets of database. So from that perspective, regardless which sets of screen, new or old, that you're looking into or utilizing, your database is still the same. And that allows us the opportunity to, turn off one set of screen when there's a new replacement to be applied.
Great, thank you. Our next question comes from an individual who says, as I understand this, California demonstration project, what does that mean and what are the risks?
John replies.
So if I understand the question right, what does it mean is we are accountable and we have to deliver. We're planning on being accountable and deliverable and delivering in an iterative fashion. And our Department of Social Services partners and our county partners, as well as OSI as a project management arm, have to work in concert to be able to do that. So as we look at this, this is a different accountability mechanism, a different accountability mechanism where you're getting feedback sooner, quicker, and deliveries smaller, sooner, and quicker. So what does it do? It mitigates risk. It doesn't allow you to go down the path 2, 3, 4 years and find out that you have issues, problems, and those types of things. It allows you to make mistakes. We're going to make mistakes, but it won't be at a point in time where we can't recover from those mistakes. We could recover, adapt, learn from them, and move on from those mistakes. So, if I understood the question right, it's a different delivery and accountability model but we're all accountable to delivering these systems.
And this is Amy. I think there was two part also in addition to what John responded. Why is the label demonstration? As this project using this methodology, because we all felt that it's the best way to apply it, that does not necessarily mean that the Agile software development methodology would be applied to any subsequent initiatives that's coming up. First, by applying to this, demonstrating that it does allow us the room and space to make that mistake, but very quickly to modify course. But at the same time, not just, holistically saying, yep, moving forward, all of the project California Engage is going to apply this. That's why it is labeled as demonstration. The risk come along with it is there will be, a lot of checks and balances that need to be put in place, probably even more so than what we're facing today. But we welcome those checks and balances as we going down this road with the demonstration project, because that is going to allow us to find where the holes are and fix it quickly.
John replies.
And one other risk that Peter mentioned as well as Dave mentioned is that the state in this position has to be able to step up and be a system integrators, that there isn't that single vendor. So we're going to have to be working with our vendors, knowing what they're doing and knowing how they're delivering them and being there and looking and coordinating activities. So we have to act as our own system integrators as we go forward, and that's a level of responsibility, and with responsibility comes some risk.
Thank you. This next question is for Dave for 18F. Are there any known issues with using open source code, specifically around security and confidentiality?
Dave replies.
So actually, it's the opposite. Open source code generally promotes security and done right avoids problems with confidentiality. So you shouldn't be locking personal identifiable information into your version controlled source code. Like, that should never happen. And if it's open source, you actually have a lower likelihood that that's ever going to be the case, because if there is an issue, there are existing tools that allow you to identify that there's a problem and remove it from the source code repository. One of the perceptions is that if there's from obscurity, there's security, but as everyone knows, hackers don't wait for documentation, and hackers don't wait for you to disclose what bugs exist. They find those vulnerabilities and they exploit them, but having a broad open source community and using strong tools allows you to avoid those risks. And the reality is that open source is on every single piece of technology that we care about. SQLite is powering your phone. Apache is running on just about every single server, or at least a majority of servers on the internet. So open source software is not something that is exotic. It's just something that has only really in the last 5 years come into maturity around application development. But at this point, the tools are better for open source than for a lot of closed source, and they create a broader community of protections for things like confidentiality and security.
Thank you. This last question is for California around contractors who are on pre-qualified Agile lists. Are all issued a statement of work and given the opportunity to offer for the work? And secondly, if you have a poor performing contractor, are you terminating for convenience? And how do you select follow-on contractors?
So this is Peter from California, and I'd like to start by saying we don't currently have a pre-qualified vendor list for Agile software developers. So everything we talk about is signaling our intent, but it does not exist today. The goal of being able to identify the ability for a software development firm to deliver is to be able to evaluate their ability to, in a rapid time period, much like 18F's Agile BPA, take a problem set, solve the problem set, demonstrate how they solve the problem set, showing their work, so that we can see that on day one, when they show up to work with us, they're ready to engage in producing high-quality products that can be fully tested and accepted by the customer within a sprint. The goal will be to promote that ability as a primary mechanism combined with a scope of work and a price evaluation activity that allows us to engage in a partnership. And like any procurement, if the partnership doesn't work for either partner, have a mechanism that allows for a graceful exit so that the state can engage in a partnership with another comparable vendor that can continue to work with the state to meet those needs. So I think to talk about the specifics of how we would do something that doesn't yet exist may be a bit premature.
Thank you. I think that is all the time we have for questions at this time. I'd like to turn it back over to Joyce.
Thanks, Christy. Let's go to the next slide, please. I would like to, on behalf of ACYF, certainly extend a thank you to not only Raphael and Dave and John and Amy and Peter and Terry, but certainly to all of you who have attended. Next, please. We certainly hope the information shared with you today was informative and valuable, and I think we will all be watching California's new experience with great interest. We wish you the best of luck. Again, this webinar has been recorded and will be made available online. When it is complete and posted, we will send a message via the SACWIS Manager's listserv with the link.
A recorded version of each of the webinars will be available for viewing online at https://www.acf.hhs.gov/programs/cb/research-data-info-systems/training.
Next, please. Again, thank you for attending, and we have included the contact information for our respective presenters, and you are welcome to contact them directly with any questions that you may have or any comments. Again, thank you and goodbye.
Presenter contact information: ACYF Commissioner Rafael Lopez. Email rafael.lopez@acf.hhs.gov. Phone number 202-401-1149. Terry Watt, State Systems. Email terry.watt.act@acf.hhs.gov. Phone number 202-690-8177. Dave Zvenyak. Email vladlen.zvenyak@gsa.gov. John Boulay. Email john.boule@osi.ca.gov. Phone number 916-263-4111. Amy Tong. Email amy.tong@osi.ca.gov. Phone number 916-642-6230.